How does the Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter work? How does it know when to charge or discharge our battery? And what is the most important component for making sure the system runs properly? That's exactly what we will be discussing in today's episode. A very warm welcome to a further video on my English YouTube channel. Most of my subscribers, or rather my customers and channel members, might be surprised by the title of today's video and may be thinking, what new things could Alex possibly tell us about this? We already know the difference between a hybrid and a string inverter, and it's clear that any electricity we don't use is stored in the battery before it goes to the public grid. But I'd argue that very few people actually know how it all works in detail. The proof of this is the countless questions I receive every day like, "Hi Alex, how is it possible that even with my battery at 80% full and my SOC minimum set at just 20%, I am still drawing 300 watts from the grid and nothing from my battery? How is it that my power is going back to the grid even though my battery isn't fully charged yet?" That's what today's episode is all about. And more, if the people who keep asking me this question already knew what I am about to explain in this video, they would clearly understand this phenomenon because it simply can't work any other way. I promise everyone who stays until the end will fully understand how their hybrid system works. And anyone who watches this entire video will never ever ask me this question again. This video is intended as a refresh for those who believe they already understand how it all works. But I also want to make sure I'm reaching those who are new on this topic, whether you are planning to set up a photovoltaic system or just joining me for the first time. Honestly, I probably should have released this video much earlier because the value you will get from this episode will make it easier to follow along with many of my other videos and better understanding the key concepts. This video is important, so make sure to stay until the end as always. It's going to be exciting. Share it with your friends and take a moment now to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. As you know, I am Alex and now I would say, let's do this. As everyone who has a Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter combined with the triple power battery knows, any electricity we don't use is stored in our battery system. This should be clear to anyone whose system is properly installed and configured. But I would say that very few people truly understand how and why this works the way it does. That's exactly what I'm going to explain to you now. This explanation might take a few minutes, but keep in mind that what I'm going to describe in simple terms actually happens in mere fractions of a second, sometimes even in milliseconds. And of course, it's no surprise that these little things, the CT clamps, once again play a crucial role. These are always included in my setup, but you can also replace them with a smart meter if you prefer. I will explain more about it later in the video. So, let's imagine the following scenario. We turn on the Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter simply by powering it up, or let's say it was in standby mode and wakes up in the morning as soon as the sun comes up. At that point, the inverter starts operating in grid parallel mode. Now the MPP trackers, these are the electronic components built into the inverter where we connect our PV string, start working as soon as they reach around 200 volts. At that point, they try to draw as much current as possible from the solar panels. And if that's successful, the MPP trackers adjust themselves to what's called the maximum power point, which I've already explained many times before. The MPP tracker's job is to extract the maximum possible power based on the intensity of the sunlight hitting the modules. It converts this power into direct current or DC, which has a constantly changing voltage and varying amperage depending on how much sunlight is available. This DC power is sent from the modules to the inverter for further processing. This direct current is then converted inside the inverter into a form that we can actually use, alternating current or AC, with 230 volts, a frequency of about 50 Hz, and a current range measured in amperes, which depends on the power generated by the sunlight. But this power doesn't go into the battery just yet, because the inverter has no way of knowing how much power we actually need in our household at that moment. It can't tell if I'm sitting in the sauna, cooking, ironing, or if I am even home at all. It doesn't know if I need the power for my desert or my buffer storage. How could it possibly know? And that's why the inverter sends all the power it generates into the house grid first, where it gets distributed according to our needs across different circuits. The devices in the house then take whatever amount of power they need at that moment. So, if your Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter is producing more power than we are using in the household, because the sun is shining so brightly outside, what happens then? No. The power doesn't go straight into the battery just yet. Why would it? Why should go the power to the battery right away? For the power to go to the battery, the Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter would first have to issue that command. But the inverter still doesn't know how much power we actually need using in the house. All it knows is how much it generates from the sun and how much power, how many amps at 230 volts is flowing out from its AC output. That's all he knows at this point. As I mentioned before, our household devices, also called loads, take the power they need. Now let's assume that the Solax Hybrid Inverter is generating more power than it's currently being consumed. Where does the excess power go? For a very brief moment, the surplus power flows into the public grid, whether we want it to or not. And this happens even with zero-feed-in systems. This power, which flows into the grid for a brief moment, is also called reactive power. On its way to the public grid, this power has to pass through the CD clamps, with one clamp sitting on each of our three phases. These CD clamps are connected to our inverter with a data cable. Every time this CD clamps detects that power is flowing, specifically in this case from the inverter to the public grid, they report it in real time back to the Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter. The inverter is programmed so that, at least in self-consumption mode, zero power should be measured at the CD clamps. It does everything in its power and everything within the power of its batteries to ensure that no energy flows through these clamps, neither in one direction nor the other. So, when these CD clamps tell the inverter that power is flowing into the grid, for example 2 kilowatts, what can the inverter do? Let's say it decides not to send those 2 kilowatts out through the AC output and instead feeds them into the battery. What would happen then? The CD clamps would measure zero. I think that makes sense to everyone. And that's exactly what the inverter does. It feeds those 2 kilowatts into the battery storage. And do you know how long it keeps doing this? It does it as long as the CT clamps continue to measure 0. As long as they detect no power flowing, the inverter will keep feeding power into the battery. Let's take the following example. The Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter is producing 5 kilowatts based on the current sunlight conditions. These 5 kilowatts are then coming out of the AC output. And for just a fraction of a second, let's say I'm standing in the kitchen cooking, my stove and oven together draw 4 kilowatts. Now let's assume our Solax inverter is producing 5 kilowatts at that moment. That leaves a surplus of 1 kilowatt. And this surplus, as I explained earlier, goes into the public grid for that brief moment because the devices don't need more than 4 kilowatts. The inverter wants 0 to be measured, so it reduces its AC output by 1 kilowatt. Instead of wasting that energy, it feeds this 1 kilowatt into the storage battery. And it keeps doing that until something changes in the current situation. Now let's imagine I put my plates in the mini oven to warm up because I always do that to keep my food from getting cold too quickly. But the oven, for example, needs 2 kilowatt. So here's the question. What happens now? The inverter continues doing what it was doing. It still fed in 1 kilowatt into the battery and producing 5 kilowatts because, let's say, the sunlight conditions remain the same. But now, instead of needing just 4 kilowatt, we are using 6 kilowatt, including the mini oven with my plates inside. So in this situation, we're short of 1 kilowatt. Where does that come from? Good question. Well, it's not coming from the battery, but instead from the public grid. The inverter doesn't know I put my plates in the mini oven. How could it know? I didn't tell it. So since it doesn't know, that additional 2 kilowatt will be drawn from the grid and will flow to the consumers in my kitchen. And on its way, the power has to pass through these clamps again, only this time it comes from the opposite direction. And what do the clamps do now exactly? They immediately report to the inverter that there is current flowing through. And as I explained earlier, the inverter wants the clamps to measure 0. So what can the inverter do to get back to 0 measurements? It's simple. It stops feeding the 1 kilowatt into the storage like before. But we still have 1 kilowatt difference. We are producing 5 kilowatts but consuming 6 kilowatts in our household. So what's the solution? Producing more is not an option since there isn't any more sunlight, but the inverter can take the missing 1 kilowatt from the battery and release it, and then the clamps measure 0 again. The inverter does still unless there's another change in the situation. Now let's imagine that the thin cloud, which was the reason we are only generating 5 kilowatts of solar power, has moved away, and the inverter now manages to extract 10 kilowatts from its modules to the bright sunlight. It outputs this 10 kilowatts and also the additional 1 kilowatt from the battery. That means a total of 11 kilowatts are now coming out. Meanwhile, my food is ready and the plates are hot, so we are using only 1 kilowatt in the house, and therefore 10 kilowatts are being lost back to the grid again. And once again, the city clamps shout, "Hey buddy, do something." 10 kilowatts are flowing through me again. The Solax Hybrid Inverter, already a bit annoyed, has no choice but to send those 10 kilowatts back into the battery so that 0 is measured again. Most of you will now understand that it's precisely this measurement by the CT clamps that gives the Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter the ability to know what's actually happening. With this measurement device, which can also be replaced with a smart meter, the entire functionality of our hybrid system stands or falls. And this is true for any brand because all hybrid systems works the same way. That's why it's so important that these devices are measuring at the right spot, namely at the interface with the public grid. And because what I've tried to explain to you in this example happens multiple times per second, you almost never get a reading of 0 because something is always changing. The light conditions outside are constantly changing even when we don't notice it with the naked eye. The power demand in our household also fluctuates all the time. Therefore, both the inverter and the CT clamps or the smart meter are constantly under pressure, unless of course there's no PV power production and our battery are at their SOC minimum. Then the inverter just goes into standby mode and waits until the stress picks up again. In other words, when the sun comes back up. And as we all know, a snapshot of the current performance data is only uploaded to the Solax cloud every 5 minutes. It's pure coincidence when this snapshot is taken when the clamps measure 0 at that moment. The inverter is constantly under stress because something is always changing. The batteries are definitely not able to react as quickly as the changes in light conditions or the shifts in household load requirements happen. According to the same principle, both fed-in limitation and surplus regulation work. These clamps here are truly an essential component of a hybrid system. Without this measuring device, there's no proper grid parallel operation mode with a hybrid inverter. If your system isn't functioning properly, like if your battery is discharging into the grid when it shouldn't, or it's charging fully from the grid despite being said otherwise, then in most cases it's due to an incorrect installation or placement of these measuring devices. It's usually fixed within 10 seconds, but it's always the same issue. Please don't take it personally if I seem irritated when someone tells me that the system isn't working and tell me it's installed correctly. Most of the time it's because these clamps are either connect incorrectly, a wire is swapped, or they're measuring the wrong thing, like what's being consumed in the house or what's coming out of the inverter instead of what's happening at the grid. The CT clamps need to tell the Solax X3 Hybrid Inverter exactly what's happening at the grid connection point. I'm confident that anyone who owns a PV system is an intelligent person, otherwise they wouldn't have invested in one. And anyone with an IQ higher than a pair of rubber boots should have understood this by now. If someone who watches my videos experiences issues with their system, I'm of course here for you. But I also won't be upset if I get to enjoy some peace and quiet, and we will see each other again in the next episode.